What you have here is, believe it or not the whole thing. Maybe you picked that up. Yesterday, a couple of people asked me questions, and I said, well, there's a whole section of the paper on that, and then I realized, oh, that's what I didn't give you, like on the lawmaking, supposed lawmaking power of the executive. I noticed when reading it that I didn't send the footnotes. This is extremely heavily footnoted. I must have decided that I could fool people into thinking it was a shorter paper if I just left off the footnotes. But please don't just assume that I was making all those quotes up. They're really there. So the idea of the paper is to try to understand Article 2 as a text, using its drafting history and the background experience with royal executive power to understand what it's all about. And the first section of the paper is a detailed drafting history, which I think includes everything. If some of you comment and have a comment and tell me, no, you left out some little episode, please do, because I'd like to have the whole thing there. There have been some pretty good drafting histories in the past, but I don't think there's ever been one that includes everything. And in particular, the emphasis that the paper gives to the fact that the executive was really created not on the floor of the Constitutional Convention, but behind closed doors in 3 committees, and especially the Committee of Detail, I think is important, and makes this account different from most of the standard accounts in the histories of the formation of the Constitution. My essential conclusion from this was that there was a debate about executive power at the very beginning of the convention on mostly June 1st, that the Virginia Plan Resolution 7 granted the executive powers that had been vested in Congress under the Articles of Confederation to the president. Since there was no executive branch under the Articles, that meant that we were talking about all powers of an executive nature, including the full panoply of prerogative powers of the king. This immediately causes Charles Pinckney to gasp and say, "But this means that he's an elective monarch if he has all the prerogative powers of the king," and some of the leading delegates, who are sort of the protagonists of my story, Wilson and Rutledge in particular, have a fairly sophisticated notion in which they do want a powerful executive and a unitary executive, but they say not all the prerogative powers of the king. They don't want to exclude them all. They don't want to include them all. They believe that they should make a considered judgment as to which ones are going to be vested and which ones aren't. That does not carry the day in June, but much later in the convention, when Rutledge chairs and Wilson is a member of the Committee of Detail, lo and behold, that's exactly what they do. And so, if you get out your handy pocket copy of Blackstone, get yourself a list of the prerogative powers of the king, and that includes both the prerogative powers that had been claimed and either rejected or taken away from the Stuart kings in the 17th century, and also the prerogative powers that remained vested in the crown under George III. So I refer to both. If you take that list, you find, with one possible exception, every single one of them is explicitly addressed by the convention, including in Article 1, Section 8, where, by one count, 14 of the 25 powers vested in Congress were actually prerogative powers of the king under the British system. So the second part of the paper is to use what basically to replicate what I think would have been their method in going through prerogative power after prerogative power, talking about what it is, what its history was with the British, what its implications are for the structure of government, and then, as best we can tell, what the convention decided to do with it. And then Section 3 of the paper is looking at the organization of Article 2 itself with this focus on prerogative powers in mind. What matters for something being a prerogative is not its label. What matters for prerogative is what kind of power it is. And I suggest that we see 5 different kinds of power, but I'm going to focus on, you can boil those down to 3 important categories. One kind of power is a power which is constitutionally vested in the executive, does not require congressional authorization in order to be carried out, and is not subject to congressional regulation or diminution. Examples being things like the pardon power or the veto power, where the president doesn't have to ask permission to do that, and Congress has no authority to diminish those powers. Those are pure prerogative powers. Second, then there's this category also of pure prerogative powers that are qualified by advice and consent or congressional override. That would be appointments, treaties, and veto power. But that's kind of a subset. Then there's another class of cases where the president cannot act without Congress's authorization. That would include such important things as taxing, spending, borrowing, and going to war. But when Congress does act, the president can act, but congressional silence does not amount to authorization. And then the third category is, I think, the most complicated, and it doesn't happen all that, it's also not that common, but I think it's conceptually quite important. And those are powers where the president can act without advance authorization, but where Congress can, using its enumerated powers, override the president's authority. And I suggest, for reasons too lengthy to say in my 10 minutes, however long that is this morning, I say that the main source of that category of powers is the vesting clause of the first sentence of Article 2. I think most of the commentaries on the vesting clause have tended to assume that if the vesting clause is substantive in nature, that is, if it actually imparts power to the president rather than just being a kind of naming clause saying that whatever powers there are vested in somebody called the president. If there are any substantive powers, they have tended to assume that they are prerogative in nature, that is to say that they cannot be divested by Congress. They are constitutionally vested in the president in the same way that the pardon power is. I think that is not correct. That I think that the best reading of the vesting clause is that all of the powers, all of those sort of residual, unenumerated executive powers are subject to the limitations elsewhere in the document, and that includes Article 1, Section 8, so that when Congress is acting within the scope of its enumerated powers, that it can displace presidential powers that are merely under the vesting clause in a way that they cannot do for pure prerogatives. The rest of the paper, which you all don't have, is going to be applying this taxonomy to a number of separation of powers questions, of which Zivotofsky is the most recent that I'll be addressing. And Zivotofsky, I think, may very well be a good example of that last. I say may very well be because I actually think Justice Scalia is correct that Zivotofsky does not actually raise the problem of recognition, that the majority is simply I don't know, exaggerating or mistaking what it means to put the word Israel on passports, putting that aside and granting the majority its assumption that the case is about other recognition power, I argue that that Congress has the right to override the president's determination in that area. So that would be an example of that.